third of those 3 meetings that we are calling community focus group. You're the community, the focus is our finances. That's what we walked through in the first 2 presentations, if you will. And there are going to be a review slide or 2 that they'll go through. But at a high level, we talked a little bit about the school finance picture from the big, broad perspective of what impacts school budgets, et cetera, for all of us. Second meeting dialed in a little closer to what Milton's reaction and impact is on some of those things that have happened to us over the years. And tonight will be a little deeper dive into what that really means for dollars on our budget. We're going to forecast going forward what we think, what it might look like. Obviously, there are some assumptions there. We'll talk about those. I'd be remiss if I didn't. I think most of you know me. I'm Joe Martin from the school board. But this is certainly a group effort, if you will, from the whole board. And welcome to the rest of my board members that are here. Rick Mullen, Tracy Hanna, John Newmer, Ed Snow. I think that's all of us. So thanks to them too, because it is very much a group effort for this little project, if you will. So having said that, tonight, like I said, we'll do a little deeper dive into the budget forecasting. We've got a group activity at the end of the slide presentation. We're going to divide you up. I think that's what the envelopes are for, just FYI. In some small groups, the board and the administration is going to divide up and kind of be in each of those groups, if you will. The purpose there is for a little bit of, we know what we told you. We want to know what you heard. That's kind of the real summation of these three meeting series here is, what did you hear? And then, what can you share with us about what you think matters moving forward? So, having said that, I guess Rich is going to go first. Rich Hammond's our superintendent, and then he's going to be followed by Ross McPherson, who's our director of business services. So, gentlemen,
thank you, Joe.
Take it away.
Joe, as Joe mentioned, welcome to everyone. Thanks to folks who have taken part in 1, 2, or all 3 of the sessions that we've had so far. As you can see on the screen right now, back on that first session back in May, we talked about kind of big picture, state funding for schools. What does that look like across school districts throughout the state of Wisconsin? At our session on June 12th, we dialed in a little bit more into what that means for our school district, what that means for our current budget. And then today we want to talk a little bit about looking forward to future budgets, and then spend some time hearing from you. Not just, I think Joe said it really well. What have you heard over the course of our series of meetings? What are some things that you've been thinking about? And what are some thoughts that you have moving forward? And we'll talk a little bit more about our structure for that, and what our next steps will be as a school district following up these meetings. We'll be talking a little bit more about those coming out. Look to that next slide. We talked about our vision and our mission statements and our commitment to equity. We're familiar with those. We won't take time to go through those. But big parts of our vision and mission statements talk about achievement, opportunity, and community. And all 3 of those key points are very much tied to the topic that we've been talking about throughout these series of meetings. And then one more slide, and I'll turn it over to Ross. I won't go through this again because folks have seen it. If you haven't been to the meetings, it speaks to some of the many great things that are happening across our school district. We have a really, really strong reputation across our area for high student achievement, great opportunities for students, and we balance that with being fiscally responsible as a school district. Both of those things are very important to us. Providing a high quality education for our students is important for our students, families, and community, but it's also important for us to be fiscally responsible as a school district for our taxpayers. And we work really hard to find that balance. I'm going to turn things over to Ross McPherson. He's going to share some information, mainly picking up where we left off at our last meeting. We want to take an opportunity to answer any lingering questions that folks have, and then we're going to split into small groups and do some brainstorming in our small groups, because a big part of what we want to do is have this group provide feedback that we can bring back to the full school board as the school board is looking at what are the next steps from the school board level for our school district. So, things will go up.
All right. So we have a couple of goals tonight. First of all, welcome back. I was worried some people might jump on the way here tonight, so I'm glad to see everyone made it. We are going to pick up where we left off last time, doing a brief review of our last meeting. And tonight, our main topics are going to be the budgetary challenges and how it relates to the state budget cycle, the current non-recurring impact of our referendum and our deficit projections for the next 2 years. And we're going to close out for our group activity talking about the differences between recurring and non-recurring. So, last time, we took a closer look at how our operating budget is broken down. Our revenues are primarily controlled by the revenue limit, but can also be categorized as coming roughly 55% from state sources, 36% from local sources, 8% from open enrollment, and 1% from federal sources. As the state share of that revenue limit has been demonstrated to be inconsistent over time, maintaining the levy control we can here at the district level to avoid those roller coaster situations where the levy might get 1 year down the next becomes a challenge. Over time, we've also shown that our tax impact to the local community has shown a consistent decline in our mill rate on our tax rate and consistently low rate of inflation over the last 5 years. Raw numbers, the mill rate has fallen $1.77 or almost 20% during that time period. On the expenditure side, we know that our expenditures are primarily staff-based. Between 70 and 75% are represented by wages and benefits of staff. Service costs and other spending in areas of open enrollment, transportation, maintenance, vouchers, district insurance, and leases represent required but less controllable cost areas of the budget. For tonight, let's take a look at some of the timing development of the budget itself. Each state budget, especially in the last decade or so, has included inconsistencies from revenues. I think I've said that about 8 times. We know from our last few sessions that ESSER played a major role in budget development at the expense of no state revenue limit increases during the 21-23 state budget. Now that funding is exhausted, many districts are running into significant fiscal challenges in upcoming years. When we talk about the state cycle, one of the less talked about aspects of budgetary planning is how late the information is when developing a budget in the first year of the year. Typically, state agencies will make their budgetary requests in September, ahead of the July 1 budget cycle of a new fiscal year. The governor would then follow by making their presentation to the legislature, and then the Joint Finance Committee ultimately submits the budget back to the governor to review and sign. The problem is most recently that has become so late that we don't really get actionable information on what resources we have to work with until much later in that year. The last several state budgets were negotiated and signed in late June, some even into July and August. This presents a number of issues, most notably when we have to make adjustments to our budget, especially at the last minute. We might be too late for some of those deadlines we have to be statutorily, such as renewal notices for contracted staff. Those have to be submitted to staff by April. And if we don't know until June, if something moves up or down, it might be too late for us to do anything. Beyond that, we need to have things like service agreements, curriculum, and other annual agreements in place before the year begins. This requires some forecasting and very careful forecasting ahead of actionable data. And when this is what's been presented in the school funding model since 2009, 2010, usually at the end of any plan we might be doing, you can appreciate how difficult this process can become. For those of you that haven't seen this graph in previous meetings, this shows the level of per pupil funding changes over time in the revenue limit formula itself. Starting in the 2009-2010 school year, we see that it was no longer coupled to the rate of inflation as an annual increase, and instead that blue line begins to show what actually happened over the last 14 years. In the 23-25 state budget cycle, we know that we have a $325 per pupil increase and a new low revenue ceiling of $11,000 per pupil. This $11,000 becomes then the lowest multiplier threshold in the state, which includes roughly a third of all school districts. This increase is why this year we discussed with our Board of Education a number of one-time expenditures for maintenance and technology, We knew we would need this authority over the next few years to sustain current operations. Beyond the current state budget, we know very little about future years. As we start the planning process for those years on the slide here, one of our base assumptions is it has to be around what that per pupil increase in the rent movement may be. After the 24-25 school year, our projections start to show some pretty significant deficits, especially after the current non-recurring rep funding expires at the end of the 25-26 school year. Thank you. For example, in this first scenario, we're indicating that a projected per pupil change of 325 per pupil indicates a preliminary deficit of just over $200,000 starting in 25-26 and closer to $4 million in the 26-27 school year, the first year after our current recommended ends. If that per pupil increase falls to $200 per pupil, it looks more like this. Those numbers become $650,000 in the first year, and roughly $4.6 million by 26-27. No matter what we do, the state will always play a major factor in budget development. We know that $325 per pupil is in place for the current biennium, but it's not certain this will be the case in the future. There is currently in statute a guarantee, I use air quotes on purpose, guaranteed $325 per pupil for the next 400 years that is now being challenged in the courts. So it is possible this will still be around for the 25-27 city budget, but there's no guarantee. Even if it does stick around for a while, this means controlled revenue growth of about 1% a year. Compare this to the fact that expenditures will grow at a rate of 3 to 4% overall without reductions, and we have a structural deficit that each year about 2 to 3%. When the cost of some services, especially things like healthcare, transportation, and insurance, increase at rates well above 1%, we have a real problem. If the current referendum were to naturally expire after 25-26, we would immediately reduce our revenue and resources by around 5%. So, as I'm sure many of you have been wondering throughout these meetings, here's the big question. If all of this is happening after 24-25, why are we talking about this now? Well, heard the term fiscal cliff. It's all about planning. We don't get actual information to inform our budgetary planning when we actually need it, especially not in the last decade. We will start planning our 25-26 budget immediately after we set the 24-25 budget here this fall. We know where costs are headed. We can only balance school budgets 2 real ways: additional revenue and budgetary or spending reductions.
Awesome. Apologies, just for a second there. Can I have you back up to the slides that have the budget forecast data? I just want to pause and see if there are any questions from folks before we continue, because I want to make sure people understand what we're seeing. What we're seeing is got 2.
Thanks, Rich. One question I have, and I think a lot of people would have the same question, is when we did the referendum for the capital improvements, which is, in my opinion, all we did. I'll speak louder, that's fine. At that time, when we did that capital referendum for the improvements, and we also put this referendum for a non-recurring referendum, I assume that you guys did this model out 10 plus years and you knew a financial cliff could be likely, right?
Not in the, there's a couple different pieces to that.
Okay.
One is that the difference between the 2 referendums that we spoke to. The capital referendum was around providing additional space and upgrading more modern learning spaces for our students. So that doesn't provide any ongoing operational expenses. And then the second, back when the current $2.5 million non-recurring has been approved twice. It was initially approved for a 5-year period, and then it was approved when that was set to expire. It was approved again for another 5-year period.
Rich, could you remind me like the timelines, like the years, and then how like the operational or the capital improvement one?
Yeah, the capital referendum was approved in the spring of 2019, and those projects again were undertaken beginning that summer of 2019, and they took about a year and a half or almost 2 years for all of those projects to get finalized. The initial $2.5 million, I might ask Joe for a little, because Joe was on the board then.
So we're in year 9 of that 10-year window. So the voters have approved 2 5-year non-recurring referenda, and they happen to be consecutive. That's not coincidental. That was intentional, of course. So we had a 5-year window, and the numbers happen to be the same, of $2.5 million. We asked the voters for essentially the same thing, $2.5 million for operationals in a second 5-year window. And we are living in year 9 of that 10-year.
If I understand it correctly, and just from my understanding,
Right.
is it seems like there's a non-recurring in 2015, then a capital, give or take, right?
Yeah.
2019, and then a renewal of the 5-year in 2020. Am I understanding that?
Yes.
So to my question is, that second renewal, the non-recurring, why there's history or context to it that's what I'm asking is, why wasn't that has to be a recurring event?
There was some consideration of doing that, and that's something that we're going to be getting to in a couple slides from now, are the difference between recurring and non-recurring, and the advantages and disadvantages of those two. So if you hold on to that question, and then when we go through that information, you can bring that up again if we don't get that. And then I'm going to have you back up one more. That part of the issue back when that initial $2.5 million referendum was approved, and it was in place for 5 years, and then we have our next 5 years, is that with the inadequacies of state funding, even that $2.5 million hasn't been enough because of the state not keeping up with it. The inflation has grown faster than even that $2.5 million has been built. Any other questions on this information? Or I think where Ross left off was looking at some things that other districts have done in our area when they've either had unsuccessful operating referendums or they've had to make budget reductions. Because a big question that we get is, well, what are some things that we would be considering if we had to make budget reductions? So if there aren't other questions, I'll turn it back over to Ross.
That's exactly where we were, as far as what are other districts doing about the same exact issues. We are not the only ones. Many are going referendum, and having the same discussions we're having right now. Some have been successful. There were a few this spring in the area that were successful, Stoughton being one, Port Atkins being the other. But many have not been successful. Those that have been unsuccessful are now working with their boards to make some pretty significant reductions. For example, Evansville was in the spring for a referendum that did not pass. And they are now proposing to rescind quite a bit of costs, including arts programs, most rugby, music, and band programs in middle school. Beloit also had a referendum that did not pass this spring. And they're now working to address a several $1 million budget gap for this fall by reducing staff and increasing employee health care premiums. Earlier this spring, Johnson's Creek also did not pass a referendum and have been in the news about cutting their agricultural program and are consolidating other program offerings too. So, when we look at a list like this, not a great list, these are the types of things that would be considered when we're talking about reductions in certain areas of the budget that we can actually control. None of them are designed to be popular, and they don't address the costs that remain, because whatever we do, the costs that remain will still be increasing in later years at a rate higher than inflation. There's also a real risk of cutting things too far resulting in inefficiencies in the system and errors. This brings us to the question that we started to reference earlier, and something that we would ultimately have to present to the voters. What is our plan for our school district after our current referendum expires? And what type of referendum do we want to consider? The state says we have two choices. First, a recurring referendum, which adds an amount to the revenue calculation in the year it's authorized. This amount carries forward into base revenue in perpetuity. Those of you who remember my bar chart graph, the orange becomes blue. And I have copies of that that we'll look a little bit later so you can refresh your memory, but that's what I'm referring to about moving into base revenue. With recurring referenda, you can present a dollar amount all at once or phase it in over a period of years. There are pros and cons to the recurring approach. On the pro side, it establishes a desired level of funding for consistency in the future. It increases that base multiplier so we know we can rely on it in the future. And it creates some stabilization for structural deficits. On the con side, future low revenue ceiling changes could overtake things we approve. So you heard me reference earlier that low revenue ceiling of $11,000. Milton was bumped that $11,000 limit this past fall. If, by chance, that limit goes beyond what we might put forward as a recurring referendum, it would supersede that work, and we'd be back at the low revenue ceiling. There's also, with recurring referendum, the worry about a perception of permanency. That we should work with what we got, and we shouldn't be asking for more than what the state has given us. And you'll see this on both slides. Spoiler, it's still not a permanent solution. We will still have a structural deficit to address going forward. But if we plan this for the next several years, we might be able to stabilize for a longer period of time. I included the graphic here about the revenue formula itself to show in the formula how these are added at the back of the revenue formula from recurring revenue sources. On the flip side, there's non-recurring referendum. This is what the district has been doing for the last 9 years. A non-recurring referendum adds an amount to the revenue calculation in the year it's authorized. This amount is only for a temporary basis based on the year specified in the referendum question and for those years only. The pros of this is it defines a need over an identified period of time and payments. It does avoid or sidestep that perception of permanency I mentioned earlier, but it is not subject to shifts in low revenue ceiling changes. Anything in a non-recurring referendum that's approved is not rolled into the base the following year. So if you have a set amount identified 4 or 5 years, that amount will be available beyond whatever that low revenue ceiling or where your multiplier number is. On the con side, it doesn't change your base multiplier, so it's still a temporary authority. It does not establish funding permanency as a con as well. That authority will expire, like we referenced before. Our current referendum expires after 25-26. And if we had nothing else to replace that, our authority would be reduced by about 5%. And it would require reauthorization on a cyclical basis. We are now in year 9 of 10 on a two 5-year cycle. So yes, we're talking about this again, because every 5 years this would come up. Okay. So at this point, we'll turn it back to Rich, because you guys have been wonderful coming to all these, but now we're going to ask you to do something.
Yeah, before we do that, and then we circle back to the slide that had the budget reductions. You were talking about some other districts that have gone through budget reductions and some of the things that they've done. And want to share a little bit more about this, because we often get, well, how do we address $3.8 million in deficit? What are some different things that would look like? And these are kind of big picture things. And then we also want to circle back to Derek's question about the recurring versus non-recurring and make sure that we answer any questions that folks have about those two slides. But Ross has shared throughout this series of meetings that the vast majority of our expenses are for people, salaries and benefits, anywhere from 70 to 75% of our costs. And much of the remaining 25 to 30% are what could be described as somewhat fixed costs that we have less control over. So anytime our district or any other district has to make a significant reduction in expenses, it really comes down to what we pay people. And that might be the amount that we pay, it might be the benefits that we have, or it might be the number of people that we have. But it's really the only way to make significant reductions in spending for a school district is to have fewer people or pay the people that you have less. And we know that both of those things have a significant impact on our students. Having fewer people means larger class sizes, it means fewer opportunities for students. Paying people less or reducing wages or benefits means that we no longer are able to compete for high-quality people in all of our employee groups, which diminishes our experience for our students. Questions on this or on the recurring versus non-recurring?
Mike there. So I was wondering, did you guys actually have like numbers of what like a building closure would look like?
You had asked earlier about consolidated in the last meeting.
Yeah.
And I'll speak a little bit to that, and then Ross, you can chime in too. There's a few different pieces to that. One is that a big piece of it is a majority of the costs are consolidated, or the same thing as a majority of the costs across the district, that a majority of our costs are for the people. And if we do close a school, and other districts that have used that option have found that you still need to educate those kids. So we have a little bit over 80, 85 or so students at Consolidated. Those students would be attending another school. We have 4 classroom teachers, and that's the 85 students is about 4 sections. So those teachers would go teach somewhere else. And we don't have a separate administrator for Consolidated. We share an administrator between Harmony and Consolidated. There would be some staff costs. If that school wasn't there, we'd be able to save in some areas. But our overall costs, and Ross, you know this number better than I do, for running Consolidated, including everything that we do there, is approximately how much?
Just over 800,000. So that includes staff costs, utilities, maintenance, operations, and so on. But as you alluded to, even the costs that aren't tied to staff directly, and take utilities as an example, we would still own the building. So yes, if we went that far, we could talk about selling or liquidating that building. But while we still have it, can't turn the heat off. We don't want the pipes to freeze and make it unworkable for anyone who does eventually use that building again. So the idea that any pure cost of running a building is 100% recouped by closing it is incorrect. Especially for the students, as Rick mentioned, who need to be educated. We have to look at redeployment, but there's more political aspects to that too. Families that currently attend there could say, well, I guess I'm not going to go here anymore. And that not only would those students not get educated here, the revenue associated with that would leave the district with them. So,
I think another piece of a decision around closing the school that comes into play is there likely would be increased transportation costs because families that live close to Consolidated would have to be transported to a school that's further away. And then we also aren't a district where we have a ton of open space. Some districts have been going through very significant decline in enrollment. Their elementary schools might be at 60% capacity. They can close a school and absorb those students pretty well. And we could, I'm not saying that we couldn't fit those 85 students into our other K-3 schools, but it would give us little to no room for any future growth. And the last thing that we would want to do would be to close a school and then 3 years later have to come back to and sell that school, and 3 years later have to come back to the voters and say we need to build a new school because we don't have enough space.
Well, in the last session, it was brought up that the birth rate numbers are going down, and so that as a reason for not closing, it doesn't actually hold water. So I'm just, we know that the enrollment will be going down for elementary schools because of the birth rate. It just seems like I don't know, I'll just leave it there. That's
I
all.
would say just one quick thing on that. You're right that we talked about our trend, and the trend across the state has been that the rate numbers have been going down. We don't know that that is going to continue. And we also have balanced that with additional growth in the district from new families moving in. We know that there's a lot of new housing in the district right now, both being built and people moving into new housing. And oftentimes, if it's starter homes, 4 or 5 years later, you have kids that are starting 4K. So we have uncertainty about what enrollment will look like down the road, but we definitely don't want to get into a situation where we close the school and then have to come back to them and say, we need more space. No, it's something for us to consider.
Rich, I think this is an example of that. I mean, for me, school closed when I was a kid because who's going to go there? And then 15,000 people moved in around that area of the city, and it went from who needs the school to the school needs to be added on to, because even if people are potentially having less children, there's more families, and then boundaries like that area. And so I think Carmen needs to get a cautionary tale, I guess, of a school that was perceived to not be needed at one time, and now it's not needed because it's expanded.
That area especially has some likely continued housing growth.
Consolidated as well. There's so much, there's a lot of really what's going on around consolidated school. Yep.
So it's, districts have done that, it's here somewhere, have closed buildings. It definitely would be something if we needed to make $4 million plus in budget cuts, it would be something that we would need to consider. But it's not as easy as saying you could save $850,000 by closing a school.
I just have, Ross had brought up, the 325 for the next 400 years going through the courts. There is another court challenge that could impact school districts, and that's trying to overturn the Act 10, where many school districts and other state entities, local entities, have utilized some of that in plan redevelopment and contributions and whatnot. Ross, do you have offhand, and I know this is just a random number that I'm asking from you, what the amount of payments and benefits that the school district pays versus what staff are being asked to pay? If that gets overturned, that absorption into the budget could, in theory, affect the budget as a whole when it comes to benefits and.
Yes. So we have to rewind the clock quite a bit to go back to pre-Act 10, but let's pretend for a second. Biggest changes that came out of Act 10, other than the obvious changes to union powers in the state of Wisconsin, is the split between unrest payments for the employer-employee and the threshold of roughly 12% contributions. Those were not hard and fast. Many districts did go straight there, some did not. If we were to revert to those pre-Act 10 levels, it would actually add probably, I can't give you a solid number, so I'm saying this right now, I can't give you a solid number. But it's not really.
I just want that to be one of those, when they're mentioning benefits plan redesign, that if the district has to absorb those costs, that could result in a benefit reduction of coverage overall, because you as the district have to absorb those costs.
And there's a lot that's happened in the last 14 years outside of that, in the insurance industry alone, that have accelerated costs considerably, that would make that more complicated.
Let's do one quick flip back to the budget forecast slides, one or the other of the two. And Ross spoke to this, but I want to make sure that folks are alert to it. In this example, you can see the projected deficit starting with 25-26 year. And again, this is based on a $325 per pupil increase each year. Ross spoke to the fact that that's the current law, but the legislature could change that at some point. But that's kind of, in our viewpoint, the best case scenario, is if that $325 stays in place. And we can see that we have very significant projected shortfalls, even with that $325 in place. The other, with the $200, is more based on what has been more typical from the legislature over time. And you can see again, that's a deficit that's even larger in 25, 26, and then it's even larger deficits.
While we're on this, too, I want to point out that when we talk about these deficits going forward, this is a cast forward going far into the future 4 years. This assumes that we would do nothing to get ahead of these, we just let them happen. But for illustration purposes, that on our current trajectory, these deficits would materialize in a status quo budget.
Ross, one last thing.
Yep.
As we're going into the legislature going and the governor going into 2025, putting out that budget forecast, let's hypothetically say the courts rule that 325 can stay in perpetuity, but the legislature does want to continue to invest in the low revenue districts because there is such a significant amount. By addressing those continued needs with the low revenue, that could help adjust some of those balancing strategies moving forward. So this is such the first year that the legislature's done that in a strong amount of time.
This was the largest increase in low revenue since they started. It used to get a pretty even clip, and it's paused for several years, it started back up, paused again, and then it got pretty far behind, as we see in our following year graph, where we are now.
But it's not a huge increase because we're already below zero. We're already negative at one point. So
That's
we're
right.
back to where.
Thank you, that's exactly right.
So don't say we're getting this big increase and we're not.
Even with the way that we like to speak to it is that even with the increase, we're still considerably behind the inflationary costs over whatever period of time.
And that's happening across the board.
Yeah.
I mean, if you look at it across the board at all state agencies, it has not kept up with pace. But looking at it as a whole, K-12 education is the largest piece of the pie.
It is. It's shrinking as part of the pie, but it is the largest piece of the pie.
It is the largest piece of the pie. And so, while things have been decided and powers that be above my pay grade make those decisions, with the 325, one thing to take into consideration is that even if the legislature, let's say it's a Republican legislature post-November and going into the next budget, tries to repeal out that 325, the governor can still strike that. So that's why you can, in theory, continue out forecasting at least another budget cycle for that.
Right. I say there's a fairly even chance that stays around for 25, 27, but as you mentioned, it's not certain.
We want to make sure we have an opportunity for everyone to be involved in the conversation. I know that Mike keep waiting on the question. We'll take that and then we'll move.
Okay, I was just gonna ask, on this slide, it says September membership FTE, is that students or employees?
That's students. So this is a revenue limit number specifically. This is not kids and seats. This is not head count. In the revenue limit formula, we have to convert all types of student count to a combined number, including summer school,
Right.
And everything else. And not everything's counted as a one-to-one. For example, 4K students are only counted 60% of a person.
Okay.
So that's a conglomerate number, but it's also the 3-year average that's multiplied against our per pupil amount to get our revenue.
Is there an FTE for the employees?
There
We do,
is.
well, there is.
Okay.
It's not part of the.
I know, I'm just, is there one that you could provide us?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. If we circle back then to Derek's question earlier and the slides around the pros and cons of recurring versus non-recurring, if we kind of put those things in a nutshell, a recurring referendum gets added to the base. So once it's put in place, if you remember those slides from the first, it was orange when it's first in place, but then a year after that it turns to blue and it's part of each district's base moving forward. And that's why different districts have different blue bars, different revenue limits, because they've had that in place in the past. Long-term for a school district, it provides much more sustainable funding and predictable funding for school districts, rather than having to assume that what you have in place is going to eventually run out, and you're either going to have to come back and ask the voters to renew it or to do something, or you're going to have to make pretty significant budget reductions. Whereas non-recurring typically is used more for non-recurring expenses, but every district across the state that has had a non-recurring referendum has had to use it for ongoing expenses because state funding hasn't kept up with inflationary costs.
Ross, can you go back to the blue and orange line? Sorry, but could you go back to the blue and orange deviating on this one? So, as we talk about reoccurring and non-reoccurring, non-reoccurring would be perfect for something that's viewed as obviously a temporary problem, right? Going back almost 20 years here, the problem is reoccurring. There isn't any evidence to suggest in the short term that it's going to go, this is a reoccurring problem. So, if it's a reoccurring problem, having a reoccurring solution, I think in a lot of ways makes sense, because it's unfortunate and it's outside of anything that all of us in this room can do. But at the end of the day, a permanent solution for what is most recently viewed as a permanent problem makes a lot of sense in a lot of different ways.
And it's always a balancing act too, because the board wants to consider what will the community support. And there are always some community members who aren't engaged like this group is, and just kind of see you want to raise my taxes and it's going to stay in place forever, versus approve it now and come back again 5 years from now and ask me again, and I'll decide at that time if I'm going to approve it at that time. So I think the consideration that the board has made in the past has been those two things: the best sustainable solution, if it will get passed by the voters, versus something else that maybe isn't as sustainable, but might be more likely to be approved and at least meet short-term needs. And that's something that this school board is going to have to consider as we look at different options. So, and that's one of the things that, as we put into the groups here, will give you an opportunity to provide some feedback on.
You spent a lot of time talking about approaches of revenue reduction. We talked about by other districts across the region. In my experience with public budgets, for a bunch of years, is a combination of how we're able to enhance our revenues in conjunction with how we deal with revenue reduction. That ultimately gives you the balance you're looking for. Ross, are any examples of what other districts have done to enhance their revenue streams?
On their revenue streams?
On their revenue streams, everything from user fees to.
Well, yeah, we touched on that last time too.
Okay, and I wasn't here last time.
So the revenue sources itself is about 90% governed by the revenue itself.
Mhm.
So we're talking about that last 10%. And last time when we broke that down even further, the remainder of that 10%, a great portion of it comes through open enrollment, which means students coming into our district, which we get a portion of their per pupil amount from those surrounding districts. What's left is the I'll call them small potatoes, right? User fees, interest, stuff we collect on our depositories. It's not a lot of money. And there is very defined limits on what types of user fees we can assess. I'm not going to go through the entire thing, but there are state statutes that speak exhaustively. And some of them are a bit antiquated because they mention the word apparatus. Well, I don't think we're really talking about that anymore, but it's still a state statute. All this to say, yes, you can charge for registration. Yes, you can charge for course materials. Yes, you can charge for textbooks. Beyond that, you cannot charge for the teacher. You cannot charge for healthcare. You cannot charge for operational costs that are not tied to the student plan. And there's a point at which you start to wonder, is the registration, I'll pick registration fees because it's applied, how much we really want to elevate that within our system, allowable or otherwise, and have it still feel reasonable. Because at the end of the day, it is less than 0.5% of our entire budget is for fees. Beyond that, though, there's not a lot of things outside of philanthropy that can come directly to the district and especially not those that are reliably broken.
Ross, could you repeat again, the last meeting, 25 years ago, 2/3 of the budget was state funding, correct? And it was 55% for most of the measure, I mean.
So the goal, yeah, the goal, that's the first thing. The 2/3 funding commitment, yeah. The 2/3 funding commitment in the original state funding model said that of all state spending, the state will share 2/3 of that cost, distributed on an equalized basis based on property values, students, and actual spending. Which means not everyone gets 2/3, but based on your level of income and poverty in a given area, you might get more, you might get less, but it will all integrate to 2/3. That figure since 2003 has fallen into the low 50s. I believe this year's right around 54%. Is that what you're looking for?
Yes, thank you.
Rich, or, do you have any statistics that suggest the successful passage of statewide of recurring versus non-recurring referendums?
That
Yes.
data exists, so I have it at the top of my head.
There was some of that in kind of the state organizations this year about that. It used to be a little bit more varied, but especially in the last 2 years, passing rate for both are hovering at about 40% level.
So they're comparable.
They're getting very,
Last
very
couple of
similar.
years.
Okay, thank you.
What we'd like to do next is, each of you came in, picked up a card, and on that card it has one of 4 logos. We have our high school Red Hawks track there. We have our Milton M. Flying Red Hawks and our Red Hawks. And what we'll be doing in a minute is splitting up into groups based on which logo you have, and I'll explain where you go. But before we split into our groups, I want to talk a little. Before we split into groups, I want to talk through what we're going to be doing when we get in our groups. Each group will get a poster board like this. We'd like you to identify some bullet points. What are some key takeaways that we got from tonight or from our first or second sessions, things that have resonated with you? And what are some remaining questions that you may have? What are some concerns that you or people in your group have? And what are some ideas moving forward? And these will be the basis for the information that we share with our school board. And what's coming up next for the school board, before we break in our groups, is that the board will be considering bringing an operating referendum question to the voters this November, in November of 2024. If that's going to happen, the board needs to make that decision by the middle of August. By state statute, that decision has to be made in that time period. So the school board has 2 school board meetings in July and 2 in August. But a decision on whether to bring a question to the voters and what specifically that question would be would need to be made by that second Monday in August. So over those 3 board meetings between now and then, the board will be talking about different options. But an important part of the feedback, and I know we've had a number of school board members at these meetings, but an important part of the feedback from this group will be thoughts, key takeaways, questions, concerns, ideas moving forward from the folks here at the table. So we're going to utilize our tables, but maybe we can bring some of the chairs from the back around to the front, and then people in that second row, those chairs can get turned around so that they're facing the third row. And then we'll have one group in this corner, and we will have the Flying Red Hawk utilize these tables these tables right here. So we'll bring some chairs around the front and face each other. We will have the Red Hawk profile utilizing this set of tables. And then we'll leave the middle row open, and then we'll use this side in the back, will be the high school crest. And this side in the back will be the Milton M, and we'll bring around some markers and a copy of the board for you. So take a minute to grab a quick if you want, a water, or shuffle to a new spot, and we will hand out the board. don't want to get in the way of the great conversation that these groups are having, but we also have been trying to get done by 8 o'clock each night, so I want to honor that. Folks can stay right where you are. We're going to give each group just a minute or two to share out 1 or 2 key things from their conversation. I don't know if you have a group that would like to start.
First of all, I just wanted to thank everyone for coming. I know it's a hard thing to do on a nice summer night, but I appreciate your time. We had a really good conversation over here. We talked about this is, it's a state issue, but everyone in the state's dealing with the same thing, but we need to take care of it here locally. We talked a lot also about that we need to let public know what's going on in our schools, all the great opportunities that are happening. And how, if something doesn't change, what's going to happen, what kind of, anything. In my opinion is, I really worry about student achievement, because any one of those budget reductions that we talked about is going to lead to fewer opportunities for students, lower achievement. I'm missing, I guess.
Just as simple.
Oh, yeah, it's really important that we get the message out to the public in a simple way that can be understood, that we get the necessary info. It's a complicated issue, so that was another thing we had talked about.
Thank you very much. Which group would like to go next?
Really echoing a lot of what the first group said. I think the first consensus we all came to was that at the end of the day, we need to do something. The cost of inaction is just great, so we need to do something. One of the things that I think was really, what we thought was really excellent about this was that at the end of the day, no matter where you are on the opinion side of things, walking out of the meeting at the end of the day, at least you're gonna walk out here understanding why, right? You'll have baseline information, be able to say, what you decide to do is your own decision. At the end of the day, understand where they're coming from, I get it, right? And to take the opportunity to walk out of here with a I get it attitude and spread it to other people, how you effectively communicate it so other people at the end of the day, whatever they decide to do, at the end of the day, they feel like they get it. And with that, talking about, people are going to read the headlines, but really, again, going back to, how do you get it in a meaningful way that's simple enough to understand and describe to someone else? It is, that's the devil with the details. Understanding the cost of inaction, I know was mentioned, if we do nothing, what's the cost of inaction, and really being able to have people understand that. And then lastly, talking about the value of the district as a whole to taxpayers and families, and what, community is built around the school district, right? And we all hopefully take pride in it, and people that we interact with too. So really being able to communicate the value of the district and what needs to be done to keep it valuable in people's minds.
Thank you to the second group.
Yeah, we'll just move with the flow here. Some same things going on. We can control at the local level, and we can't control immediately at the state level. That cost is going up faster than revenue. That trends don't support that the state will increase their funding. And the questions that kind of came up are, what kind of costs are kids going to pay with the decisions that the adults are making? If a referendum is not approved, what is the community willing to lose? And then moving forward, again, making things simple for people. Like I said, I was very thankful I was in these meetings because I learned a lot of new terms. Took 3 meetings worth, but I think I finally got it down. Ross, you're a good teacher. And to try to share that with the community too, understanding terms and funding resources. Where do the funds come for certain projects? What our funds are used for certain things, so that it's out there right away. If something happens, where did that funding come from? So it's not a question immediately going, well, if we don't have money, then how can we do this? You don't have to just lay it all out at one time.
Thank you very much. And the fourth group.
So definitely want to echo what I think from all 4 groups is when we do go out, if we do go out, please make it simple and transparent. Because I think a lot of folks in the community were very confused by what the last referendum was. They didn't exactly understand what they were looking at. making sure that we educate more than just in this room. So the folks that came in this room, it's a wonderful thing, and thank you guys all for coming, but I don't think this is the group that needs that convincing, maybe thinking like a few. If and when the decision is made, how do we get that to the broader community? How do we get to the, I don't have any kids in the district and I'm not a fixed income person, how do we communicate to them that what the value is? Maybe more clarity on why does the school need more money for to communicate that out. The funding sources are not adequate, and then the timing of when that funding is received. And again, it's just really communication into the community.
Thank you. A round of applause to the people that spoke out. And the intent of our sessions wasn't to begin and end the conversation. The intent was to begin a conversation that continues, and not just through this summer, not just through this fall, but we want to make sure that we're doing the best job that we can of building and educating the community around school finance, around the great things that our school district provides for our students, for our families, for our communities across our school district. So your involvement so far has been very, very much appreciated. I want to thank you all for being a part of this, and want to encourage you to continue to stay involved. You can leave the poster boards at the table. We'll get those and compile them and then email them out to the whole group, to everyone that's attended any of the meetings, so that all of you are able to see what not only your group put together, but what the other groups put together. So you can expect that email coming soon. I talked earlier about what's coming next for the school board. So the school board will have some important considerations and decisions to make over the next 6 weeks or so. And then if a decision is made to bring an operating referendum to the voters, a big part of what we'll need to do between the time that decision is made and election day is getting information out. And all of you play a key role in assisting us in doing that, because we know that we can't do that ourselves. That's not a school board thing, it's not an administration thing, it's not a staff thing, it is a community thing. So from the bottom of my heart, I want to thank all of you for taking part in this series and for being part of the ongoing conversation. And to close things out, I'm going to turn things over to Joe and Martin.
So I'll echo the thank you from the board level. We deeply appreciate everyone's time and your input. The diversity of the group is important because you represent our entire community. And I would also extend the invitation beyond tonight. As this situation unfolds, share your thoughts with us. All of our emails are publicly available, both Ross and Rich and all of our board members and myself. Shoot off a quick note. If something strikes you as an important consideration or a condition that you want us to weigh in or you want to weigh in with as we put this puzzle back together, please do that, because we gained a lot of value, from these 3 meetings. But as Rich said, it doesn't end tonight. We want you to stay engaged, keep asking your questions. We need that input to formulate, whatever this looks like moving forward. So please reach out, please stay engaged. We're thankful for your participation, and I guess that's about the summation I can come up with.
Thank you all for your time.